Welcome. Settle into your bed, dim the lights, and let your body grow heavy and still. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to remember, nothing to do at all. Just a story, softly told, to carry you into sleep. Tonight, we travel back, almost 1700 years, to a city carved into rose-colored stone, hidden deep in a quiet desert valley. This is the Hush Historian. Close your eyes, if you would like. I will take it from here. Waqih woke before the light did, in the small carved chamber that had been his family's home for 3 generations. The rock around him held the last coolness of the night, the way it always did at this hour, before the sun climbed high enough to warm the stone from the outside in. He lay still for a moment, listening to Rabiat's quiet breathing beside him, to the fainter breath of his son in the next room. He rose slowly, careful not to disturb her, his feet finding the familiar smoothness of the stone floor without needing light to guide them. He passed Nabataean's sleeping form on his way to the door, the boy curled small beneath a woven blanket, one hand still faintly curled as though holding something from a dream. Waqih paused there, briefly, before continuing on into the dark. He followed the narrow channel path that ran along the base of the cliff, the same path his father had walked before him, and his father's father before that. The channel itself, carved directly into the rock, ran nearly silent this early, carrying only a thin trickle down from the higher cisterns, patient and steady, the way it had run every morning of Waqih's life. Outside, the valley was still mostly shadow, the tall rose-colored cliffs rising on either side holding their color close, waiting for the sun to draw it back out of the stone. Waqih had grown up beneath these walls, had learned as a boy that the rock changed its face with the light, pale and ordinary at midday, deep and glowing at dawn and dusk. He walked without hurry, his eyes long since adjusted to the particular darkness of this place. This was his work, and had been his family's work for as long as anyone could say with certainty. The channels, the cisterns, the careful, ancient system that pulled water from stone and stored it against the desert's long dry months, this was the thing Waqih understood better than almost anything else in the world. His father had taught him to listen to the water's sound, to know from the pitch of its trickle whether a cistern ran full or low. Below, in the wider basin of the city, the first signs of morning were beginning to stir, though Waqih could not yet see them clearly in the dim light. Merchants would already be checking their stores, the incense traders preparing for another day of transactions that had, for generations, made this hidden city one of the wealthiest crossroads in the region. He imagined it more than saw it, the way a man imagines a room he knows by heart. He stopped, as he always did, at a small carved niche near the second cistern, a modest shrine to Dushara, the god his people had always honored above the rest. He left no elaborate offering, only a murmured word and a small piece of dried fruit, the same quiet gesture he had performed every morning since his father first brought him to this spot as a boy learning the water's paths. By the time he reached the highest cistern, the sun had begun its slow climb over the eastern ridge, and the rose-colored stone around him woke fully into color, deep pink and amber catching the light in a way that never failed to hold his attention, even after 40 years of seeing it. He checked the water level with practiced ease, one hand resting against the cool stone rim, satisfied with what he found. The city below was fully waking now, the first distant sounds of voices and cart wheels drifting up through the valley's natural acoustics. Waqih lingered a moment longer at the cistern's edge, watching the light spread slowly down the cliff faces toward the valley floor, before turning back toward home, toward the smell of his wife's cooking fire and the sound of his son's voice, newly awake, calling for him. By the time Waqih returned, Rabiat had already coaxed the small hearth fire back to life, its thin smoke curling up toward the natural opening carved high in the chamber's ceiling. She looked up as he entered, flour dust on her hands from the morning's bread, and did not ask where he had been. After so many years, she knew the answer without needing to hear it, the same channels, the same shrine, the same quiet walk before the household stirred. Breakfast was simple, flatbread baked against the hearthstone, a handful of dates, a portion of soft cheese made from the household's small herd of goats. It was not an extravagant table, but it was a steady one, and Waqih had long since learned that steadiness mattered more, in a place like this, than abundance ever could. He ate slowly, listening to the small sounds of the household waking around him. Nabataean appeared not long after, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, his dark hair pressed flat on one side from his sleeping mat. He was 9 years old enough now to walk the channel paths with his father, young enough still to treat the work as something closer to adventure than labor. He settled beside Waqih without a word, leaning his small weight against his father's arm. In a few days, the incense caravans were expected from the south, the largest arrival of the season, and the household had already begun its small preparations, extra bread set aside for trade, a length of woven cloth Waqih hoped to sell at a good price. This was the rhythm the whole city moved to, the arrival and departure of caravans marking the turning of each season more reliably than any calendar. Waqih told Waqih he intended to check the lower cisterns before midday, and to see whether old Huldu, who tended the channels on the valley's far side, had finished repairs to a cracked section near the theater. Waqih said she would need more grain ground before the caravans arrived, and reminded him not to forget the small offering owed at the upper shrine before the week's end. Nabataean asked, as he often did, whether he might come along to check the highest channel, the one that ran nearest the ridge where the view opened out over the whole valley. Waqih told him perhaps later, once the sun stood higher and the path grew less slick with morning dew. The boy accepted this the way children generally accepted delay, without real complaint, already asking some other question in its place. Waqih, meanwhile, had turned to her own morning tasks, grinding grain against the worn stone quern near the chamber's entrance, her movements practiced and unhurried. She hummed faintly as she worked, some fragment of an old song without a name Waqih had ever learned, and he watched her a moment, feeling the same quiet gratitude he felt most mornings, unremarkable and complete. When the meal was finished, Waqih rose, brushed crumbs from his tunic, and told Nabataean to help his mother with the grinding before he returned. The boy groaned softly at this, the particular sound children make at any task resembling work, but did not argue. Waqih paused at the doorway, looking back once at the small scene behind him, before stepping out into the fuller light of morning. The path down toward the city's basin ran along the base of the cliffs, worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet, past other carved dwellings where households were beginning their own versions of the same morning. The valley always looked slightly different from this angle in full daylight, the rose-colored stone catching the sun in uneven bands of pink and gold. Behind him, the cliffs stood exactly as they always had, ancient, patient, entirely unremarkable. They spoke only briefly, the way men do when work waits on both sides of a conversation. Hulda mentioned the crack near the theater section, mostly repaired now, and complained, without much real feeling behind it, about his knees, about a grandson more interested in trading than in tending stone. Waqih listened, answered where an answer was expected, and the two parted as they always did, returning to their separate sections of the ancient system. The path toward the city basin passed near Hulda's section of the channel system, and Waqih found the old man crouched beside a repair, his hands still steady despite his years. Hulda straightened slowly when he noticed him, offering the same dry greeting he had used every morning for as long as Waqih could remember, asking whether the upper cisterns had held through the night, as though the answer were ever truly in doubt. The path widened as it descended toward the city's central basin, joining with paths from other carved dwellings until Waqih walked among a loose gathering of neighbors, all moving toward the same waking streets. The valley opened around him the way it always did at this hour, tall cliffs giving way to the wider basin where temples and market stalls stood carved and built in equal measure. Inside the city proper, the narrow streets held their usual morning rhythm, merchants arranging goods along stone counters, a mason chipping carefully at a new tomb facade higher on the cliff face, the sound of hammers and voices blending into the particular music of an ordinary working day. Waqih passed a spice trader arranging small jars of imported color, the scent of something sharp and unfamiliar drifting from an open sack. Near the city's center, the great temple stood as it always had, its carved columns catching the climbing sun, a handful of priests already moving through their own morning rituals near its entrance. Waqih had never spent much time in matters of formal worship beyond his own small offerings, but he understood, in his own quiet way, why the temple held the shape it did in people's lives, solid, permanent, a fixed point in a city built otherwise from trade and passing seasons. He found the merchant Rabiat had mentioned, a narrow stall near the theater, and arranged for a measure of grain to be set aside before the caravans arrived and prices shifted upward. The merchant, an older woman with quick hands, asked after the channels, and Waqih told her the cisterns looked strong this season, better than the last, though not so full as the year Nabataean was born, which had been, by every account, an unusually generous season for rain. On his way back toward the channel paths, he stopped briefly to watch the mason working on the new tomb facade, the careful, patient chipping away of stone to reveal a shape that had, in some sense, always been waiting inside it. Waqih found something familiar in this kind of labor, slow and exact, not so different from his own work coaxing water from stone that seemed, at first glance, to hold none. He passed once more through the theater district, where workers were repairing a section of seating damaged some seasons back, in the last tremor anyone could clearly remember. Waqih thought little of it, the way anyone thinks little of old, half-forgotten repairs, evidence of a city that had always found ways to mend itself and continue. He left the city center the way he had entered it, unhurried, the sounds of trade and labor fading gradually behind him as the path climbed back toward the channels. Above him, the tall cliffs held their steady color in the strengthening light, patient and unremarkable, exactly as they had every morning of his life. Back among the channels, the sun now well above the ridge, Waqih returned to the work that had always structured his days, section by section, testing each junction where stone met stone, where centuries-old joints still held the water on its careful path. It was slow, repetitive work, and it had never once felt tedious to him, not in the 30 years since his father first placed his small hand against the cool channel wall to teach him how to listen. He remembered that lesson more clearly than almost anything else from his boyhood. His father crouched beside him at this same stretch of channel, telling him that water always spoke if a person learned its language, a full cistern humming low and steady, a crack revealing itself in a thinner, higher note long before the eye could find it. Waqih had thought, at the time, that his father was simply telling stories. He understood now that he had been telling the truth. The channels had belonged to their family's care for 3 generations, since his grandfather had first been trusted with the upper sections by the city's elders, back when the system was younger and still occasionally failed in ways it rarely did now. Nobody remembered exactly why the trust had passed to their family rather than another, only that it had, and that it had never once been questioned since. It was not glamorous work, and Waqih understood this plainly. Nobody in the market thanked the channels for the water in their cups, nobody praised the cisterns when the caravans found the city green and generous against the surrounding desert. The work succeeded, precisely, by being invisible, by never once calling attention to itself, and Waqih had made a quiet peace, long ago, with loving something that asked to be forgotten in order to work correctly. He thought, as he moved along the channel, of Nabataean, of the boy's small hands already beginning to learn the shape of the stone the way Waqih's own hands once had. He did not know yet whether his son would want this life, this particular invisible devotion, but he found he did not need to know, not today. There would be time enough for that question later, the way there always seemed to be time for the questions that mattered least urgently. He paused at a section near the lower cistern, remembering the dry year when Nabataean was still an infant, when the rains had failed twice in succession and the whole system had strained under the weight of a city unwilling to ration what little it had left. His father had still been alive then, and the two of them had worked side by side for nearly a month, coaxing every last measure of water from channels never designed to be stretched so thin. They had succeeded, that year, though only barely, and Waqih still carried a private, unspoken pride in it, the kind of pride that never needed an audience to feel complete. The city had never known how close the margin had run. It had simply continued, the way cities do, trusting a system it never had to think about, and Waqih had decided, somewhere in that dry season, that this was the finest kind of work a man could do. Near midday, checking a lower joint he had inspected 100 times before, he noticed the stone slightly warmer than usual beneath his palm, and a faint mineral taste in the water that had not been there the week before. He considered it only briefly, attributing it to the season's heat, to the particular dryness of this stretch of summer, and continued along the channel without further thought. By the time he straightened from the last junction, the sun stood nearly overhead, and Waqih allowed himself a moment simply to look back down the length of the channel he had spent the morning tending, water moving quiet and certain through stone his family had cared for longer than anyone could precisely say. It was, as it had always been, more than enough. When the sun stood highest overhead, Waqih made his way back toward the upper channels, where Nabataean was already waiting with a small woven bag balanced against his hip, sent by his mother with bread, dates, and a portion of soft cheese. The boy had clearly hurried, dust on his sandals, and he presented the bag with the particular pride children reserve for tasks they consider important. They sat together in the narrow shade of an overhanging ledge, one of the few real patches of shade along this stretch of the channel, the rock above them still cool despite the climbing heat. Nabataean ate quickly, more interested in talking than in the food itself, describing at length a lizard he had chased near the cistern that morning, its exact color, the way it had vanished into a crack too narrow for his hand to follow. Waqih listened without needing to say much, offering the occasional question to keep the story moving, content simply to sit in the shade with his son's voice filling the quiet space between them. It was, he thought, one of the few true luxuries this work allowed, this unhurried middle hour, half the day's labor finished, the rest still ahead, but for now, only bread, shade, and a child's small, endless observations. Somewhere below, though he could not see it from this height, the city continued its own midday rhythm. Hulda would be resting in whatever shade his section of channel offered. The spice traders near the temple would have pulled their awnings lower against the worst of the heat. Petra did not stop at midday so much as it slowed, the way anything sensible slows when the sun insists on it. Nabataean finished his food and lay back against the stone, looking up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the ledge and the opposite cliff face, asking, in the unhurried way children ask questions with no real urgency behind them, whether the channels ever grew tired of carrying the same water down the same path every day. Waqih considered this longer than the question strictly required, and told him he did not think stone grew tired of anything, that some things were simply better for staying exactly where they were placed. He did not tell his son that this had always felt, to him, like the truest thing he believed, not only about channels, but about the life he had built from tending them, about the particular devotion of choosing one hidden, unglamorous task and refusing to imagine any other. Nabataean would not yet have understood the weight behind so small a statement, and Waqih saw no reason to burden an ordinary afternoon with it. A faint breeze moved through the narrow gorge as they rested, carrying with it the same mineral scent Waqih had noticed earlier near the lower joint, a little stronger now than before. He noticed it only distantly, the way a person notices any smell they have known their whole life, present but unremarkable, folded into the ordinary texture of the day. Eventually Nabataean grew restless again, as children do, wandering a short distance to inspect a cluster of small plants growing improbably from a crack in the rock, narrating their situation to no one in particular. Waqih watched him a while, then closed his eyes briefly against the light, allowing himself the small, guilty pleasure of doing nothing at all for a few minutes longer than the day required. When he finally rose, brushing dust from his tunic, the worst heat of the day had already begun to soften, the light shifting toward the longer, gentler hours of afternoon. He gathered the empty bag, took his son's hand, and together they began the walk back down toward the lower channels, the gorge settling once more into its familiar, patient quiet. The afternoon settled into its familiar rhythm, Waqih returning to the lower channels while Nabataean trailed behind, half helping, half playing, gathering loose pebbles that had fallen onto the path. The heat had softened slightly from its midday peak, and the work felt easier for it, the kind of steady, unremarkable labor that filled most of his afternoons this time of year. It was Nabataean who noticed first, though he did not think much of it, that the cistern near the boundary wall tasted stranger than usual when he stopped to drink, faintly bitter, almost metallic. He mentioned it to his father only in passing, the way children mention most things, and Waqih told him it was likely nothing, that water sometimes tasted odd this late in a dry season. A short while later, the ground beneath them trembled faintly, barely more than a shiver, gone almost as soon as it began. Waqih paused, one hand resting against the channel wall, waiting to see if it would return. It did not, at least not right away. Tremors were not unusual in this valley, not since anyone could remember, and most people had long since stopped treating the small ones as anything worth mentioning. A dog belonging to a household further down the gorge began barking without any obvious cause, a thin, persistent sound carrying faintly across the still afternoon air. Waqih noted it the way he noted most background sounds of the valley, present but unremarkable, one small detail among the 100 small details that made up any ordinary day of outdoor labor. Overhead, a loose formation of birds shifted direction more abruptly than birds usually did, wheeling once around the cliff face before continuing on toward the open desert. Nabataean looked up and pointed, delighted by the sudden movement, asking his father why they had turned like that. Waqih said he did not know, birds did as birds pleased, and returned his attention to the channel in front of him. He crouched to inspect a joint near the base of an older section and found the stone slightly warmer there than it had been that morning, warmer even than usual for this part of the valley. He pressed his palm flat against it for a moment, feeling it, then decided it was simply the accumulated heat of the day working its way down through the rock, nothing more unusual than that. Rabiat called from the direction of home, her voice carrying easily across the quiet gorge, asking whether Nabataean had finished gathering what she needed for the evening meal, whether Waqih intended to check the far boundary before the light began to fade. He answered that he would, in time, and continued along the channel, unhurried, the small strange details of the afternoon already fading from his attention the way small details always did. The cliffs, when he glanced toward them out of habit rather than concern, looked exactly as they always looked, tall and calm against a sky beginning its slow drift toward evening color. If anything had changed about the valley, Waqih could not have named what, and he did not spend long looking, his attention already returning to the work in front of him, to the ordinary demands of an ordinary afternoon. Nabataean grew tired of gathering pebbles before the task was finished and wandered instead toward a patch of hardy desert flowers growing near the boundary wall, humming some tune of his own invention. Waqih let him go without comment, the gorge quiet again except for the soft sound of wind moving through narrow stone passages, the distant bark finally settling, the afternoon continuing along its familiar, unremarkable path. Outside, the household's goats seemed to agree with Rabiat more than with Waqih. They pulled harder than usual against their tethers, and a pair of desert birds nesting in a nearby crevice refused to settle, circling instead above the chamber roof. Nabataean found this more amusing than troubling, chasing after the goats with the delighted seriousness children bring to any small chore turned game. Waqih returned briefly to the channels in the last hour of usable daylight, walking the familiar path one final time out of habit rather than necessity, checking nothing in particular, simply moving through the space the way a man moves through a room he loves without needing a reason. The stone looked exactly as it had that morning, patient, solid, indifferent to whatever small uncertainty had settled over the humans tending it. He noticed, without much alarm, that the cistern water did taste faintly different to him as well when he stopped to drink, not unpleasant, simply unfamiliar, carrying a mineral edge he could not place. He drank it anyway, the way a person drinks water they have relied on their entire life, without serious consideration of an alternative. As the light began its slow amber decline toward evening, Waqih found himself glancing at the surrounding cliffs more often than usual, not out of any specific concern, but the way a person's eyes are drawn, almost against their will, toward the one thing in a landscape that has recently, however slightly, become unfamiliar. By the time he turned back toward home for the evening, the tremors had not returned, and the day's small unease had mostly settled back into something closer to the ordinary shape of every evening before it. By mid-afternoon, the tremor from earlier returned, stronger this time, enough to rattle the clay water jars lining the chamber wall and send Rabiat's hand instinctively toward the doorframe. It passed within a few heartbeats, as the first one had, but it left behind a small residue of attention that had not been there before, a faint awareness that something, somewhere, was different from an ordinary day. Huldu appeared at the boundary between their sections not long after, moving faster than his knees usually allowed, asking Waqih if he had felt it too, if he thought it worth mentioning to anyone. Waqih said he had felt it, and that he did not know who such a thing would even be reported to. Tremors were the valley's business, not the business of merchants or priests, and neither man could think of anyone whose task it was to answer for the ground itself. A hairline crack appeared along the inside wall of the chamber where Waqih stored his older tools, thin as a hair, easy to miss unless a person happened to be looking directly at that patch of stone in the right light. Waqih noticed it while reaching for a length of rope, ran his thumb along it once, and decided it was nothing more than the ordinary settling any old carved wall eventually developed. Rabiat, preparing the evening meal, admitted to Waqih in a quiet moment that the tremors made her uneasy in a way she could not quite explain, not fear exactly, more a small, persistent unsettledness, the way a held breath feels before it is finally released. Waqih told her, gently, that the ground had shaken before and always settled again, that there was no reason to believe this time would be any different. Dinner came earlier than usual that evening, though nobody in the household could have said exactly why, only that the day had felt long in a way that made the ordinary hour of eating seem, without discussion, worth moving forward. Rabiat set out a simple meal, flatbread, a thick stew of lentils and dried herbs, a small portion of preserved fish traded from a caravan weeks before. They ate together near the chamber's entrance rather than fully inside, the evening air pleasant after the day's heat, the first stars beginning their slow appearance above the narrow strip of sky visible between the cliffs. Nabataean recounted, for the second time that day, the story of the lizard he had chased that morning, embellishing it slightly further with each telling, and neither of his parents corrected the growing exaggerations. Waqih found himself unusually quiet through the meal, not from any particular worry, but from the pleasant exhaustion of a full day's labor settling into his limbs. He watched his wife and son across the small space, the lamplight catching the edges of their faces, and felt the same quiet gratitude he had felt that morning, unchanged by anything the day had briefly threatened. Nabataean asked, between bites of bread, whether the shaking earlier meant the mountain spirits were angry, a question children sometimes ask with more insight than they intend. Waqih told him the ground did not feel anger any more than it felt kindness, that stone simply shifted sometimes the way anything old and heavy occasionally shifted, without meaning or intention behind it. Rabiat added little to this explanation, though Waqih caught her glancing once toward the darkening cliffs beyond the chamber entrance, her expression unreadable in the low light. She said nothing more about her earlier unease, and Waqih did not raise it again, both of them content to let the ordinary comfort of the meal replace whatever small uncertainty had passed between them that afternoon. After the meal, Nabataean was permitted, as a rare treat, to stay outside a little longer than usual, chasing the last of the evening light with the same restless energy he had chased the goats with earlier. Waqih watched him from the entrance, arms crossed, feeling the particular tiredness that comes only from a day spent almost entirely in careful, physical work, a tiredness he had always privately considered one of the better kinds available to a man. Rabiat began clearing the simple dishes, humming again the same wordless tune from that morning, and Waqih found himself, not for the first time, marveling quietly at how little his life required to feel complete. A full table, a healthy son, a wife who hummed while she worked, a system of stone and water that had, against considerable odds, remained entirely his family's own. The cliffs, visible now only as a darker shape against a darkening sky, gave no further sign of the small disturbances they had offered earlier. Waqih allowed himself one last glance toward them before calling Nabataean inside for the night, and found, in that glance, nothing to suggest that tomorrow would ask anything different of him than today had. The household settled slowly toward sleep as it always did, lamps extinguished one by one, small sounds of the day fading into the deeper quiet of night. Morning arrived quietly, unremarkably, the household waking to the same routines that had governed every morning before it. If anyone in the house still carried yesterday's small unease, it did not show itself in the ordinary business of rising, dressing, and beginning the day's first small tasks. Waqih walked his usual path to the upper cistern, offered his usual quiet word at the shrine, and returned to the channels much as he always did. It was closer to midday when the sound came, low and distant at first, more felt than heard, a deep pressure in the chest before it registered fully as noise. Waqih straightened from the joint he had been inspecting and looked toward the surrounding cliffs out of pure instinct, the way anyone looks toward the source of an unfamiliar sound, even before understanding what they are searching for. Others along the channel had felt it too. Huldu appeared at the boundary wall again, slower this time, his expression harder to read than it had been the day before. Neither man spoke immediately. They simply stood together, looking in the same direction, two channel keepers whose entire understanding of this valley had, until this moment, never required them to look at the surrounding stone this closely. Down in the city basin, though Waqih could not see it from where he stood, similar small gatherings were likely forming near the temple, along the market stalls, outside the theater, ordinary people pausing their ordinary tasks to glance upward, exchanging the same unspoken question without quite finding the words to ask it aloud. The city did not panic. It simply paused, briefly, the way a room pauses when a door creaks somewhere unseen. Rabiat came to the chamber entrance, one hand shading her eyes, and called to ask if Waqih had heard it too. He told her he had, and that he did not know what it meant any more than she did. Nabataean, standing beside his mother, seemed more curious than afraid, tugging at her sleeve to ask whether they might climb higher to see the valley better. Waqih considered, briefly, walking further up the channel path himself, toward the section where the view opened more fully over the whole gorge. He decided against it, telling himself there was still work to finish, that whatever had made that sound would likely settle the way the tremors had settled, without requiring any particular response from a man who tended water for a living. The sound did not repeat immediately, and the gorge slowly resumed its ordinary quiet, birds returning to their usual movement, the household's goats calming after their brief startled pulling at their tethers. Hulda remained a while longer before returning to his own section, remarking only that it had been some time since the ground had made a sound quite like that one, though he could not say how long exactly, or what it had meant the last time either. Waqih returned to his work with the deliberate, unhurried attention of a man choosing not to dwell on something he could not explain. The channel still needed checking, the season's work still continued regardless of what sounds the ground chose to make, and there was, in the end, very little else the valley demanded of him beyond continued, patient attention. By early afternoon, the strange quiet of the morning had mostly resolved itself back into ordinary rhythm, though Waqih noticed, without quite admitting it to himself, that he glanced toward the cliffs more often than he had the day before. Rabiat met him at the chamber entrance, Nabataean's hand held tightly in hers, both of them looking past him toward the dust now rising thick along the upper cliffs, the light overhead strangely dimmed by particles hanging in the still afternoon air. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. There did not seem to be words suited to what surrounded them. Around the gorge, Waqih could hear other households beginning to stir, doors scraping open, voices calling across boundary walls, a rising murmur of confusion that had not yet organized itself into full fear. Hulda's voice carried faintly from somewhere down the channel path, though Waqih could not make out the words, only the tone, uncertain, questioning, entirely without precedent to draw from. Waqih made the decision, without much deliberation, that they would not attempt to leave the gorge, not yet. The tremors, however violent this last one had been, seemed to have passed for the moment, and some quiet, stubborn part of him still believed the valley capable of settling, the way it always had before, the way the small cracks and warm stone had settled in the days prior. He gathered his family close to the chamber entrance instead, away from the most exposed sections of cliff face, and told them, with more confidence than he entirely felt, that they would wait and see, that panic solved nothing a calm household could not solve better. Rabiat did not argue, though her eyes returned again and again to the dust still drifting down from the heights above them. It happened without warning, though later Waqih would spend considerable time trying to recall some sign he had missed, some final moment of stillness before everything changed. He was crouched beside the upper cistern, testing a joint he had checked 100 times before, when the ground beneath him gave a single hard lurch, throwing him sideways against the channel wall. The sound that followed was unlike anything he had heard the day before, a deep, tearing roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rolling down through the gorge and into the city basin below. Waqih pushed himself upright, one hand still braced against the stone, and looked toward the cliffs, already knowing, before he fully understood it, that something had irreversibly changed. Dust began rising from the cliff faces above him, thin at first, then thickening as unseen cracks opened somewhere higher along the rock. Small stones broke loose and clattered down the slope near where he stood, and Waqih heard, distantly, the sound of something larger giving way further down the valley, a deep grinding crash that ended as suddenly as it began. Nabataean's voice reached him from the direction of the chamber, not yet frightened, simply startled, calling to ask what was happening. Waqih found he had no answer that would not frighten the boy further, and so he gave none at all, moving instead toward home at a pace quicker than his usual walk, though still short of anything resembling panic. The dust continued falling for a long while after the worst of the shaking passed, settling over the gorge in a fine gray layer that coated the chamber entrance, the path, the boundary wall, all of it slowly disappearing beneath the same pale coating. The air carried a dry, gritty texture that caught in the throat, and Waqih found himself coughing softly, more from surprise than discomfort. Rabiat gathered what cloth she could find and fastened pieces of it loosely over her face and Nabataeans, an improvised protection against the thickening air, her movements quick but not yet frantic, the practiced efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing a household through whatever circumstances arrived at her door. Waqih did the same, tying a strip of linen across his nose and mouth, the fabric already dulled gray within minutes. Somewhere in the settling quiet, he became aware of a sound that had always been present, so constant he had never truly noticed it until it changed, the steady trickle of the upper channel running past the chamber. It had gone silent. Waqih listened for a long moment, hoping he was mistaken, before rising to check what he already suspected. The joint nearest the chamber had cracked wide open, water that should have continued down toward the lower cisterns now pooling uselessly against broken stone before finding some new, unintended path into the earth. Waqih stood looking at it for longer than he meant to, feeling something he did not immediately have words for, a loss distinct from fear, quieter and somehow heavier. They moved inside as the dust continued settling, gathering in the small central chamber, the entrance partially blocked with cloth against the thick, dry air. The light that filtered through the gaps had turned an odd, muted gray, neither day nor evening, something the household had no prior word to describe. Nabataean sat close against his mother, quieter now, though still more curious than afraid. Waqih thought, in the settling dust, of every joint and channel he had tended that morning, wondering how many more had cracked in ways he could not yet see, how much of his family's 3 generations of careful work now lay broken somewhere beneath the settling gray. He thought of Huldu, of the merchants near the theater, of Nabataean's small hands that had only just begun learning the shape of stone his father was no longer certain would hold. He considered, more seriously now, whether they ought to leave the gorge entirely, to take whatever they could carry and move toward the open desert beyond the valley's walls. But the paths, he reasoned, would already be thick with others attempting the same thing, and the worst of the shaking, however violent, seemed to have passed. He told himself, again, that waiting remained the wiser choice, that the carved chamber around them offered more protection than an open path would. Nabataean grew tired as the afternoon wore on, the strange gray light and settling quiet working on him the way any long, unusual day eventually works on a child, and he fell asleep eventually against his mother's side, his small breathing steady despite everything that had happened. Rabiat held him without moving, her own eyes fixed on nothing in particular, some middle distance where worry and stillness met. The strange gray light outside the chamber began, gradually and then all at once, to fail entirely, the afternoon collapsing into a darkness far deeper than any ordinary evening should have produced this early. Waqih understood, without needing to look outside to confirm it, that the settling dust had finally thickened enough to blot out what remained of the day's light. He lit the single oil lamp they kept for such occasions, its small flame casting a modest, trembling light across the chamber, enough to see Rabiat's face, Nabataean still sleeping against her side, the familiar shapes of their small household now made strange by the totality of the darkness surrounding them. Nobody spoke for a long while. There did not seem to be anything useful left to say. From somewhere beyond their walls, faint sounds began to reach them, carried strangely through the dust-thick air, voices calling to one another across distances Waqih could not judge, the particular tone of people trying to locate each other in darkness that had arrived far too suddenly for anyone to have prepared for it. He listened without moving, unable to make out words, only the shape of urgency behind them. Rabiat asked, quietly, whether he thought they had made the right choice in staying. Waqih did not answer immediately, turning the question over the way he turned over most difficult things, slowly, without hurry, even now. He told her, finally, that he did not know, that no choice available to them that day had carried any certainty behind it, only degrees of uncertain hope. The dust continued settling beyond their sealed entrance, audible now as a persistent, whispering weight against the stone, occasionally accompanied by a heavier sound that Waqih chose not to examine too closely, some larger fragment of cliff finding its way down from whatever the ground continued disturbing above. The chamber held. It had held through tremors before, cut from solid rock generations ago, and Waqih chose, in this moment, to trust that history. Nabataean stirred once, briefly, murmuring something unintelligible before settling back into sleep, and Rabiat adjusted the cloth around her son's small shoulders with the same unhurried tenderness she brought to every ordinary night, as though the darkness surrounding them were nothing more than an early and unusually thorough evening. Waqih moved once to check the chamber's inner storage, more out of restless need for motion than any real purpose, and found the crack from days before slightly wider than he remembered it, though still nothing that suggested immediate danger. He returned to the main space without mentioning it, seeing no reason to add this small detail to whatever quiet fear already sat unspoken between them. The distant voices beyond their walls grew less frequent as whatever time passed and that unnatural darkness continued to pass, though Waqih could not have said whether this meant people had found safety, or simply that the dust itself had grown too thick for sound to carry as it once had. He preferred, in the absence of any way to know, to imagine the former. They remained together in the small circle of lamplight, the three of them, the household reduced to this single warm point inside a darkness that had swallowed everything beyond their walls. Waqih reached for Rabiat's hand across the narrow space between them, and she took it without needing to be asked, both of them settling into the only thing left available to do, which was simply to wait, together, for whatever came next. At some point in the long, formless stretch of that darkness, Waqih stopped trying to measure how much time had passed. The lamp's oil burned low, and he did not refill it, choosing instead to let the chamber settle into a gentler, dimmer glow rather than risk it guttering out entirely later, when they might need it more. Nabataean woke again, this time more fully, and asked in a small voice whether it was still today or already tomorrow. Waqih told him he did not know, that the ground had made its own kind of night, one that did not follow the ordinary rules of morning and evening. The boy accepted this answer the way he accepted most things his father told him, without argument, curling closer against his mother's side. Rabiat began, quietly, to hum the same wordless tune she hummed every morning of Nabataean's life while grinding grain, and Waqih found something in the sound that steadied him more than he expected, the ordinary made suddenly, achingly precious simply by continuing to exist inside a day that had stopped resembling anything ordinary at all. He thought, in the stillness, of the channels beyond their walls, of the water system he had spent his whole life tending, now cracked and silent somewhere beneath a weight of stone and dust he could not see or measure. It did not feel, in this moment, like the loss he might have expected it to feel like. It felt smaller than the two people sitting beside him, smaller than Rabiat's hand still folded into his. The sounds from beyond their walls had grown fainter still, the world outside reduced now to the steady, endless whisper of settling dust and the occasional distant sound Waqih chose not to name even to himself. He kept his attention instead on the small, warm space around them, on his son's breathing, on his wife's quiet humming, on the particular gift of having exactly the people he loved most within arm's reach. Nabataean asked if they might tell a story, the way they sometimes did on ordinary nights before sleep, and Waqih found himself agreeing before he had fully decided to, reaching for the same simple tale he had told his son 100 times before, of a small bird who built her nest too close to a flooding wadi and had to decide, each season, whether to move it higher into the rocks. Nabataean knew this story by memory and corrected him twice regardless, and Waqih let him. Rabiat's eyes, in the low lamplight, held something Waqih recognized without needing her to name it, the same quiet acceptance he felt building slowly in his own chest, not resignation exactly, but a kind of settling, the particular peace that sometimes arrives once every possible choice has already been made. He did not know, in that narrow chamber, whether morning waited for them on the other side of this darkness, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the question mattered less than he might once have expected. What mattered was this chamber, this lamp, these two people breathing steadily beside him, the whole of everything he had ever wanted folded into a space carved from stone no larger than a single small room. The lamp finally guttered out sometime after Nabataean had fallen back asleep, and Waqih did not light another. There seemed little reason to, and some quiet part of him found the darkness easier now than he expected it to be, familiar in its own way, the same darkness that had once greeted him every morning before dawn, simply arriving now from an unexpected direction. The air inside the small chamber had grown heavier as the hours passed, though Waqih noticed this the way he noticed most things now, at a slight remove, as though observing the day from just outside himself. He kept one arm around Rabiat, her head resting against his shoulder, and felt Nabataean's small warmth pressed against her other side, the three of them arranged exactly as they had been for what felt, by now, like a very long time. He thought, in these last quiet hours, mostly of ordinary things. The channel joint he had touched that morning, warmer than usual beneath his palm. The particular way Rabiat's hands moved while grinding grain against worn stone. Nabataean's small bag, hurried and proud, delivered across a gorge that had felt, that morning, entirely unremarkable. He found he did not want to think of anything larger than these small, complete moments. Rabiat's breathing had slowed beside him, steady and unhurried, and Waqih matched his own to hers without deciding to, the way a person's body sometimes settles itself around another's without needing instruction. He could not have said, in that final stretch of darkness, whether he was afraid. Mostly he felt tired, in the deep, complete way a long day's honest labor had always left him. The sounds beyond their walls had gone almost entirely silent by now, the world outside reduced to the same patient, endless weight it had carried for hours. Waqih found this silence, strangely, more peaceful than the earlier distant voices had been, as though the whole gorge had finally agreed, together, to simply rest. He thought once more of the cliffs, tall and calm for as long as anyone could remember before this single, unremarkable morning had asked something different of them. He held no anger toward the stone, only the same quiet acceptance Rabiat's eyes had carried earlier, the understanding that some things could not be reasoned with, only endured, or not endured, depending on factors no channel keeper's patience could ever have accounted for. Nabataean shifted once against his mother, murmuring something too soft to catch, and Waqih reached over to rest his hand briefly against his son's small back, feeling the same steady rise and fall he had felt every morning of the boy's life, through the thin wall separating their rooms, before he ever rose to walk the channels alone in the dark. The chamber grew heavier still, the air thick and warm in a way that made even breathing feel like a slow, deliberate task, and Waqih found his own eyes growing difficult to keep open, not from fear now, but from something closer to the ordinary, welcome heaviness of the end of any very long day. He closed them there, in the dark, with his wife's breathing slow beside him and his son's small warmth folded against them both, and let himself rest, finally, the way a man rests at the end of the truest, fullest day he has ever known, surrounded by exactly what he had spent his whole life building toward. Centuries passed over that narrow gorge, seasons turning without witness, the cliffs settling back into the same tall, patient calm they had held for ages before that one unremarkable morning. The channels Waqih and his family had tended for 3 generations fell gradually silent, their careful joints cracked beyond repair, the city they had once fed slowly emptying as trade routes shifted and the desert reclaimed what people no longer maintained. When explorers and scholars finally returned to study the valley in detail, centuries later, they found the carved city remarkably whole beneath the dust of ages, facades and chambers preserved in a stillness no ordinary passage of time could have granted them. Among the many things they traced, patiently, across years of careful work, were the channels themselves, faint grooves cut into stone that had once carried water across impossible distances through an unforgiving desert. Researchers learned, eventually, to map these channels meter by meter, tracing the same patient system of cisterns and conduits that had, for generations, turned a hidden desert valley into one of the wealthiest crossroads of its age. In doing so, they uncovered evidence of maintenance and repair spanning hundreds of years, careful hands correcting the same joints again and again, evidence of a family, or many families, who understood that some things needed tending long after any reasonable person might have stopped expecting thanks for it. Nobody now remembers the name of the man who tended those particular channels on that particular morning, nor the name of the woman who hummed while she ground grain in a chamber nearby, nor the small boy who once chased goats across a gorge that no longer exists in any shape he would recognize. Their names, like so many names from that ordinary morning, were never written down anywhere that survived. But the channels remained, in outline, in the patient grooves the stone had kept for them, evidence of care taken across generations by hands that believed, in their own unremarkable way, that some things were worth tending quietly, worth maintaining long after any reasonable person might have stopped expecting a return. The cliffs still stand today, tall and calm, exactly as they stood on every ordinary morning before that one, walked now by visitors from across the world who look up at carved facades rarely thinking of the small, unremarkable lives that once filled this valley, tending water, trading grain, humming quiet songs while the light moved slowly down rose-colored stone. Somewhere along a mapped channel on that valley floor, a modern visitor might stand today without knowing it, in almost exactly the spot where a man once paused each morning at a small carved shrine, offering a single piece of dried fruit and a quiet word before beginning the long, ordinary work of an entirely ordinary day. There is a particular kind of peace, perhaps, in being remembered not for anything dramatic, but simply for having tended something patiently, for having devoted a life to work that asked to be forgotten in order to succeed, and having loved, in the end, exactly the people closest to him, exactly as much as any of us hope to be loved, at the end of our own ordinary days. And so the cliffs keep their long, patient watch still, over a valley that has forgotten a great many names but has never entirely stopped holding, somewhere in its stone and dust, the quiet shape of a family who chose, until the very last hour available to them, simply to stay close together. Sleep well. This is the Hush Historian, and I will be here, softly, whenever you need me again.